Now it's time for our weekly energy update with Dan McTeague, President of Canadians for Affordable Energy. All yours, Dan.
Well, thank you for that, David. And we are looking at some pretty interesting volatility in the energy markets globally. Looks like they're again back to taking the position that the world is coming to an end, and as a result, there's plenty of supply and not enough demand. They're overreacting, I think, to the idea that Chinese demand is down, and of course, the banking issues in the United States reemerging somehow dictates how people are going to be driving the behavior of using energy like oil and gas and propane and natural gas and the like. The reality is that while we saw oil hit $78 a barrel last Friday, it's now down to $72 a barrel. That's $6 decrease or 10% drop just goes to show you how dysfunctional the energy markets are, and that they're no longer driven by people who are actually actively trading supply within the energy complex. It's being driven by artificial intelligence. It's being driven by algorithms because it isn't being driven by common sense, and certainly not by fundamentals. Be as it may, it's still good news for consumers. And while we saw prices peak this past week, uh, you know, issues of geopolitical concerns, such as the United States responding to the death of the three soldiers in Jordan, is not taking any effect. It means that we could see gasoline prices week over week drop about 5 to 7 cents a liter. So, what does that mean? Well, in places like Vancouver, where the main refinery is still out, in other words, there is no refinery producing gasoline in all of Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, you're still looking at a decrease. We saw $1.75 last week. We're at $1.65, $1.68 for Saturday. Look for that to drop another 3 cents back to 163 by next Friday. We are seeing for the rest of British Columbia prices remaining in the $1.60 range. While if we go over to Alberta, nothing's moving. Prices are still remaining in the $1.19, $1.20 range. We're also looking at a scenario in Saskatchewan where prices simply are frozen. They haven't moved. They're still staying at the $1.33 range. And if we go to Manitoba, ditto, same thing, $1.22.9 at most gas stations there. For Ontario, and I don't, by the way, for the prairies, for Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, best case scenario because they tend to only move in certain small, steps week after week. They don't see those changes like we see in other cities across the country. We're not likely to see much of a change, maybe a 3 cent decrease by this time next week, although that remains to be seen. For Ontario, gas prices are going to remain in the vicinity and around the idea that it'll be continuing to hold at about $1.44, $1.45. You'll find some stations are cheaper because they're discounting their retail margins about 8-9 cents a liter. So some stations could be as low as $1.35. Either way, I'm still thinking there could be a 2 cent decrease between now and next week, pushing prices down to levels we haven't seen since the early part of December. Of course, we're looking at Quebec, always 12 cents more expensive than Ontario. So whatever it is here, 12 cents a liter there, with a high of no more than $1.56 and as low as $1.50. For the Maritimes, Atlantic Canada, we've seen prices move up, especially on the diesel side, but for gasoline in the $1.60 range, $1.65, look for those prices this time next week to drop a full 3.5 cents a liter. With diesel being, of course, the variant, weather has become a little warmer in North America, and given that there is no prospect for any type of cold, at least for the next week and a half, it looks like consumers are going to get a bit of a break. And whereas we saw, the second and third week of January prices moving much higher, they're now likely to move much lower. There are other factors that are going to be driving prices which cannot be predicted. As I mentioned earlier, it's likely that we are going to, David, see a scenario where geopolitical issues are going to start to mount, especially in terms of any response by Britain and the United States to what has happened in the Red Sea. So far, markets have very carefully ignored the tensions there, something we have never seen in our time, which leads one to the conclusion that energy markets are not very reliable these days in terms of any long-term forecasts. I do believe, however, that the year 2024 will be more expensive than 2023, not just because the federal government is increasing carbon taxes, not just because its green policies are sapping the value of the Canadian dollar, especially when it comes to trade and resources like oil and gas, which they are continuing to try to hem in. I also believe that fundamentals are going to start to weigh much heavier. That means for 2024, look to pay a little bit more, probably about another 5 to 7 cents more than you paid in 2023. That's it for this week, David. Let's talk next week.